the next section we're going to talk very, very briefly about some social equity issues. This is a huge topic, right? We could do an entire multi-day workshop just on these issues. But I want to just highlight a couple of pieces that I think powerfully relate to the learning mindsets that we've been talking about. And just to sort of point you towards a book that I think has really opened my eyes around like the social equity gap between rich and poor that is growing in this country and becoming as big of an issue as the race equity issues that we know are also really, really important. And they interact with each other, so it's not to suggest that it's one or the other. They actually map onto each other, and we're going to look at a video, like I mentioned yesterday, from the superintendent of Baltimore talking about that. Have you seen that video? No. So the book that that I draw a lot from in this section is Robert Putnam's Our Kids. And Robert Putnam is at Harvard, and he did this very extensive mixed method study looking at drawing on a lot of the literature, so a really big kind of literature review, looking at the research that's out there, but also doing really extensive interviews with families in very different communities to sort of pull from that as a source of data as well. So the book is rich with actual stories of kids and families in these different communities and what kinds of issues that they face and what kind of supports that they have or don't have, and how does that impact their ability to be resilient in the face of something that comes along and sort of knocks you sideways. So the one piece that I'm just going to talk a little bit about is between the gap between rich and poor, and how it's showing up in communities and schools in terms of how it's affecting what students have access to. So there is this growing gap between the rich and poor, which I love about this program that you're all part of. And I spoke with the fellow who actually was the one who had the genesis for this project that you guys have been able to participate in, that it really was about bringing people together from very different communities so that you could partner together. And so what Robert Putnam was pointing attention to is that this growing gap is really problematic because people are living in greater and greater segregation in terms of their class. And so compared to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, far fewer opportunities and interactions across class lines. So I think about this in my own life because for me, even though our family was poor and there was not a really strong culture of going to school, one of the families that our family through the Catholic Church became very connected to was a family where the father was a doctor and they had a very strong education norm, and I got to learn about that through them. So a couple of their kids came down, they lived 2 hours north of us. We were in the city that had the university, and they lived with us while they were going to university, and I got to see what it looked like to be a college-going student. Even though at that time I didn't have a concept that I could do it, it still exposed me to it. And so that was really an important piece. When I read this, I realized like, oh, I'm part of this demographic. In that age group growing up, I actually had a lot more interactions across class lines. And it wasn't something I thought about as a resource that I had. So segregation is affecting the kind of resources that are available to schools because so many schools get their funding based on the income from tax, right? The revenue that goes to schools is dependent on where you live, your zip code, and property values. So only 4 states really have fair funding rules where the schools that are serving students with higher needs actually get compensation to help support those higher needs. And in fact, a lot of them, there is actually, get less funding based on being poor schools. And you all know this. I know that this isn't new information. So the SES gap now for kids entering kindergarten is actually 2 to 3 times greater than the racial gap. So it is having a really profound impact on these kids. Increasing use of track system and college, like the access to those kinds of programs is really different depending on the resource level of the schools. And the schools, like you all know, the schools that are often in these poorer communities, they are also less desirable. So when teachers become more experienced, they tend to move out of those schools. So it's just not always what's happening, but often that is what's happening. So I want to, like I mentioned, share this little video clip with you. It is about 8 minutes long. So the talk that she gives is a lot longer, and she goes into sharing more. She talked there about what they're doing at the central office level, but she actually goes and burrows into it, into the principal level, into the classroom practices level, and ends with a really beautiful piece where she shares a song, a rap song that a student created about their experience in that community. I found her talk to be really compelling. The idea that the decisions that they're making are replicating those patterns of the past, to me, felt so important for us to all think about in terms of what's going on in our communities and the meaning making that we're doing about why students are or are not engaged in the classroom are not separate from the context that those students are living in. So I wanted to just add on to this. We're going to talk a little bit more about a couple other pieces, looking at like what are the larger contexts that are driving our interpretations of what's going on. In this book, I'm going to hand out a chapter 1, or at least part of chapter 1 for you guys on this. Is from an interview that I did with a dean of a university, the dean of education program at a university, who's really taken this and tried to look at what can we do to support teachers in shifting their lens of how they're understanding their students' perspective. And I haven't fully read the book because I just got it, because it's just been published recently, and I just talked to him like a couple weeks ago. But I found that in the chapter 1, there's a table in which he offers reflexive questions that shift the lens from just a reflective lens as a teacher to a critically reflective lens, to really directing your attention towards thinking about what is going on for the student in this activity that I brought into the classroom. What are they experiencing? So I'm going to hand these around after the end, so you're not like trying to look through it while we're doing this. And if you have time tomorrow, I would encourage you to maybe have some discussion around what you thought about some of the difference between these questions, and maybe things that you think about. And I would encourage you to think about like some of your most challenging students, to even keep those in mind as you go through and think about these reflection questions in the table. So with that, let's just move through. So this issue that she's highlighting is the investment that the district office is making in the schools, right? So just one example of how this difference shows up in a lot of schools, and this is from Robert Putnam's work, is that the difference in how much resources available in a school for extracurricular activities is quite different, and it's changed over time. And so the question is, though, why should we care about this? Why is it important? And it turns out that kids who consistently participate in extracurricular activities are more likely to go to college, not a little bit, but 400% more likely. So with they're 70% more likely to go to college than those with episodic participation. But to me, this was so huge that I felt like I feel morally obligated to share it with educators now. Like, if you want to do one thing to support your students. Now, why might extracurricular activities be useful in context of the learning mindsets that we've been talking about? Yeah, all these things we've been talking about, really. The like kids learning growth mindset there, and then being able to generalize it. What's that? It's ridiculous. I mean, but how did they come up with so it turns out that extracurricular activities and their impact has been really, really widely studied. Like, what he's drawing on in our kids is actually a lot of data sets pulling this together. And what they found is that higher participation in extracurricular activities leads to higher GPA, higher educational aspirations, more positive work habits. That makes sense, right? You learn the rigor of practice and the value of it, and then you generalize it. More psychological resilience, I think this piece of psychological resilience is partly probably because you have to go through experiencing a lot of failure and recovery, right? And you also develop stronger social networks, right? So it's the belonging and growth mindset link there too. So it also has been shown to be correlated with higher future wages, but having lower participation in extracurricular activities is correlated with more truancy rates, delinquency, dropout rates are higher, riskier behavior, and here's the real problem, right? There is this gap. The top line there is the higher SES communities, the bottom line is lower SES communities, and this is from 1970 to 2010. So this is a problem, right? And what you also see is that in these higher poverty schools, you have about 50% fewer of these activities available, but there's also a pay-to-play norm, right? Yeah, and you also often have to have good grades to be able to get in. So the very students who could use this the most are getting the least access.